In the twilight of the galaxy's greatest age, the Eldari stood as living gods. Their empire was a lattice of starlight stretched across the void, their artistry so refined that a thought could sculpt matter, a sigh could birth symphonies. Theirs was a civilization where suffering had been banished, where death itself was but a minor inconvenience, and every desire could be conjured from the ether. They mastered the warp's secrets, their minds able to weave reality as deftly as their hand-shaped crystal domes that floated between suns. Material needs dissolved into irrelevance, and in their crystalline sanctuaries, the Eldari turned inward, seeking new frontiers of sensation, new heights of beauty, new depths of experience. Yet abundance without boundary becomes a cage, and perfection, left unchecked, breeds its own undoing. The Eldari, with lives measured in millennia, and souls tuned to the warp's infinite melodies, found themselves adrift in a sea of satisfaction. What is left when all is possible? For them, the answer was sensation, first as art, then as philosophy, and finally as addiction. The cult of pleasure spread, not as a revolution but as a whisper, a gentle invitation to seek the next thrill, the subtler ecstasy, the sharper pain. The boundaries between art and experience, between pleasure and agony, dissolved. The Empire's heart became a festival without end, its masked revels and secret rites moving ever further from restraint, ever closer to the precipice. But in the Imperium, the warp that mirrored every mortal thought and dream, this tide of sensation was not without consequence. The psychic resonance of billions, each act of excess, and each shudder of delight began to pool and coalesce. Their collective hunger became a shadow with gravity, a darkness that learned a name. Slaanesh was not born in an instant, but gestated in the Eldari soul for millennia, each boundary crossed and each taboo shattered, feeding its embryonic hunger. Seers and outcasts saw the warnings, visions of a coming darkness, of a hunger that watched and waited, but their voices were lost amid the symphony of sensation. Some, sensing the storm, left the core worlds behind. Craft worlds, vast, self-sustaining arcs, became lifeboats for those who clung to ancient disciplines, their departure dismissed as eccentricity by those who remained. Others, the Exodites, sought refuge on distant maiden worlds, swearing oaths of humility to soil and kin. The Harlequins, followers of Commorragh, vanished into the Webway's winding shadows, carrying their own enigmatic hope. But the heart of the Empire, drunk on its own perfection, could not look away from the abyss it had created, and then the universe screamed. The birth scream of Slaanesh was less a cry than a cataclysm, a psychic detonation that scoured souls from flesh, shattered palaces of crystal, and imploded worlds into a wound that would never heal, the Eye of Terror. Billions perished. In a heartbeat, their souls devoured by the god they had unwittingly nurtured. The core of the Eldari civilization became a howling void, reality torn open and remade as a monument to their ultimate hunger. Those who survived, by fate, by foresight, or by desperate accident, emerged into a world where even survival was a form of damnation. For the survivors, the trauma was not merely loss, but an emptiness that gnawed at the soul, a hunger that would never leave them. They called it the soul thirst, the price of Slaanesh's birth, a cold mouth at the heart of every living Eldari that widened with every heartbeat. To live was to feel oneself slowly, inexorably, consumed. Each group of survivors faced this horror in their own way. The craft-worlders embraced discipline and self-denial, binding themselves to rigid paths lest any emotion lead them back to ruin. The Exodites trusted to humility and simplicity, hoping that a return to the land would shield them from the curse. The Harlequins danced on the knife edge of fate, mocking the gods even as they defied them. But there were others, those who, finding themselves in the labyrinthine hollows of the Webway, refused both denial and surrender. They were revelers denied their feast, aristocrats stripped of flattery, murderers who suddenly felt preyed upon. Their answer was as cold as it was logical. If the thirst could not be denied, it could be delayed, if only by feeding it foreign agony. If suffering could be harvested, refined, and drunk, then for another day, another year, they might cheat damnation. These refugees, with their exquisite talents for cruelty and survival, began to gather in the forgotten nodes and ancient vaults of the Webway. places old when their empire was young, market voids and pleasure domes that remembered the price of hope. Thus, a new society was born, not from hope, but from necessity, not from unity, but from the cruel arithmetic of survival. They built Commorragh, the Dark City, a labyrinth whose arteries were portals and whose heartbeat was fear. Here, pain became currency, cruelty became wisdom, and mercy was remembered only as a cautionary tale. They were not yet called Drukhari, not yet a people with a name sharpened into a blade. But in those shadowed halls, the logic of their new existence was forged. To survive, they would become the predators, the harvesters of agony, the architects of despair. And so, the wound in paradise bled on, its echo shaping every moment of their new lives. In a city built on the ruins of hope, every act of cruelty was both a necessity and a defiance, a refusal to go quietly into the darkness they themselves had unleashed. The question that haunts them, whispering through the endless corridors of Commorragh, remains unanswered. When survival demands that one become the monster, what remains of the soul worth saving? And as their city of shadows grows, the reckoning they have delayed draws ever closer, waiting in the dark, between heartbeats. In the aftermath of Slaanesh's birth scream, as the wound in paradise bled across the stars, the survivors faced a choice that would echo through eternity. The scattered remnants of the Eldari Empire found themselves thrust into a universe where their very existence had become a form of slow suicide, where each heartbeat drew them closer to the hungry maw of She Who Thirsts. Some fled outward to the craft worlds, binding themselves to rigid paths of discipline and denial, their souls wrapped in spirit stones like precious relics sealed against the dark. Others became corsairs, dancing on the razor's edge between salvation and damnation, gambling their souls on moments of brilliant intensity that burned like stars against the void. But there were those who looked upon these choices and found them wanting, a third path that required neither the craft world's spiritual castration nor the corsair's desperate gamble with fate. These survivors, nobles and outcasts alike, turned their eyes not outward to the stars, but inward to the labyrinthine depths of the Webway itself. Here, in the ancient network of tunnels that had once been the arteries of their empire, lay passages and nodes that predated even their golden age. Forgotten way stations and abandoned pleasure domes where reality grew thin and the old rules no longer applied. The migration began not as organised exodus, but as gradual drift. Small groups fleeing the psychic storms that raged through real space, finding themselves drawn to these shadowed refuges. The Webway remembered what its creators had forgotten, and in its deepest reaches lay spaces that even the ancient Eldari had feared to inhabit for long. These were places where the barriers between dimensions wore gossamer thin, where the very architecture seemed to whisper of older, darker purposes. It was into these forbidden depths that the future Drukhari descended, not seeking mere sanctuary, but consciously choosing to inhabit the darkness itself. What they discovered in those twilight realms was not emptiness but memory made manifest. Commorragh was already there, waiting like a predator in the shadows, a name that cut the mind like a blade, meaning the place between places in the old tongue. This had been a nexus of the pre-fall empire, a port city where the wealthy and powerful had gathered to indulge appetites too refined for the common worlds. Even shattered by the fall's psychic shockwaves, it breathed with malevolent potential. Vacant palaces hung over void plazas like fossilized sighs, their wraithbone walls scarred but unbroken. Sub-realms flickered in and out of phase, their rune anchors dim but intact. The city had survived what its makers had not, and it hungered for new inhabitants to fill its empty halls. The soul thirst taught them their first and most crucial lesson. In those early seasons of exile, more died by despair than by blade, their spirits slowly consumed by the gnawing void that Slaanesh had left within every Eldari soul. But necessity, that cruelest of teachers, invented doctrine from desperation. Captives were taken from the Webway's lesser byways, human explorers who had stumbled where they should not tread, greenskin pirates lost in corridors with no sky, scattered refugees from a dozen species fleeing the fall's aftermath. The survivors learned that agony had weight in the warp, that terror possessed its own psychic resonance, and that suffering, properly cultured and refined, could be distilled into spiritual sustenance. At first, their methods were crude. makeshift torture chambers in abandoned transit halls, siphon altars cobbled together from broken psychoreactive tiles, desperate nobles counting screams instead of counting coin. But the Eldari had always been swift students of their own nature, and the Webway itself remembered techniques that predated their fall from grace. The flesh scholars emerged from the shadows, surgeons and artists who had once served the pleasure cults, offering their expertise in exchange for sanction. They called themselves Haemonculi, and their price was simple: permission to practice their art without restraint, to explore the boundaries between life and death, flesh and spirit, agony and ecstasy. With their covenant sealed in pain and necessity, Commorragh began its true transformation. Cruelty moved from desperate impulse to sophisticated infrastructure, each act of torture calibrated for maximum psychic yield. The city's ancient manufactories were repurposed to create new instruments of suffering, pain engines that could harvest agony with industrial efficiency, splinter weapons that turned death into prolonged symphony, shadow fields that bent light and hope alike. The survivors discovered that fear, properly orchestrated, sang louder in the warp than simple pain, that a village taken at dawn yielded less psychic resonance than a world raked by midnight rumours of approaching terror. Power followed the logic of scarcity, and those who controlled access to this new currency of suffering became lords in their own right. The earliest cabals emerged not as the elegant political engines they would later become, but as predatory households gathered around charismatic murderers and exiled nobles who understood that in this new reality, authority flowed from the ability to deliver fresh agony to the city's hungry foundations. They carved districts from Commorragh's carcass and stitched them to their names with treaties written in blood and terror, their warriors drilling not for set-piece battles but for raids, measured in heartbeats, and harvests counted in screams. The city grew like a malignant organism through the Webway's arteries, absorbing neighbouring pocket dimensions and forgotten vaults, its architecture expanding through folded space into realms that existed only in the gaps between realities. Rune anchors were reforged to bear new burdens, their original purposes perverted to serve darker needs. Market voids that had once traded in art and song now dealt in captives and the refined instruments of their torment. Portal gates long sealed were pried open by Haemonculi, who stitched dimensional mathematics into living flesh, creating doorways that bled into real space like wounds in the galaxy's skin. As Commorragh's influence spread, so too did the transformation of its inhabitants. Those who clung to the old virtues found themselves outmaneuvered, exploited and ultimately consumed by those who adapted more swiftly to the new arithmetic of existence. Compassion became a fatal vulnerability, mercy a luxury the city would not permit, and empathy a weakness that predators learned to target with surgical precision. The survivors who thrived were those who could read the shifting currents of fear and desire, who could turn another's weakness into their own strength, who could harvest suffering as efficiently as their ancestors had once cultivated beauty. There were those who argued for another path, who remembered the disciplines that had allowed some to escape the fall's initial devastation. They proposed meditation chambers and inner fortresses against the thirst, philosophical bulwarks against the city's consuming hunger. Commorragh buried them first in laughter, then in unmarked graves. The Dark City's logic was too clear, its mathematics too precise. Every heartbeat was a debt to Slaanesh, every moment of restraint a step closer to the abyss. Philosophy that could not feed the soul thirst became a luxury the city would not afford. Mercy was recast as treason against survival itself. Yet even in this austerity of cruelty, echoes of the old empire persisted like ghosts in the machine. Courts reassembled themselves around new thrones built from crystallized screams, etiquette adapted to accommodate daggers and poison, and hierarchy returned because hierarchy could organize hunger more efficiently than chaos. The city's artificial suns were remade, their gentle pre-fall luminance replaced by sterile stars that illuminated without warming, that measured time in pulses of dread rather than cycles of hope. In the spaces between spaces, the ancestors of the Drukhari had found their sanctuary, but the price of admission was nothing less than their souls. They had fled the darkness that consumed their empire only to become darkness incarnate, each act of calculated cruelty pulling them further from the light they had once known. They were the echo of Slaanesh's birth scream made manifest, forever falling yet forever refusing to accept their damnation, embracing the very methods that had birthed their cosmic nemesis, in a paradox of survival that would define them for millennia to come. And as their city of shadows continued its cancerous growth through the Webway's forgotten arteries, its spires reaching into dimensions that should not exist, the question that had driven them into exile remained unanswered. What becomes of predators when they perfect the art of being exactly what they are? As the refugees of the Fall settled deeper into their twilight sanctuary, and their philosophy of calculated cruelty crystallized into doctrine, Commorragh itself began to transform in their image. The city that emerged was not merely architecture but apotheosis, a living testament to what the Eldari could become when genius was wedded to necessity and beauty was sacrificed upon the altar of survival. What had once been a nexus of refined pleasure became something far more sinister, a metropolis that grew not according to the laws of physics or the needs of its inhabitants, but according to the dark mathematics of the soul thirst itself. The dark city defied comprehension, spreading through folded dimensions like a cancer of crystallized malice. Where once the ancient Eldari had built with harmony and proportion as their guides, the Drukhari constructed with cruelty as their architect. In Commorragh, the map became a lie told by streets that shifted between heartbeats, bridges that unspooled like silk and knotted themselves into new patterns, towers that pivoted on invisible axes to keep certain windows forever shrouded in shadow. The city breathed, inhaling fear and exhaling opportunity, its very existence a violation of natural law made manifest in stone and shadow. The architecture itself had become weaponized, each spire and surface crafted to maximize both terror and efficiency in the harvesting of suffering. Towers rose in impossible spirals that bent space around themselves, their surfaces carved from materials that existed only in the spaces between realities, living shadow given substance, crystallized screams made into stone, the fossilized echoes of 10,000 years of refined agony. These structures possessed their own malevolent consciousness, their walls drinking in the psychic resonance of fear and pain, growing stronger and more twisted with each feeding like parasites of pure malice. High Commorragh emerged as the crown of this labyrinthine nightmare, its serrated spires reaching through dimensional barriers into realms that mortal minds could not even imagine. Here, the greatest Archons carved their palaces from the bones of extinct civilizations and the crystallized tears of dying worlds. The Palace of Shades twisted through 17 different dimensions simultaneously, its corridors existing in states of quantum uncertainty that made navigation an art form requiring both genius and madness. The Needle of Sorrows pierced the veil between realities so completely that its apex existed in pure concept, a throne room built from the idea of suffering itself, where thought became architecture and nightmare took physical form. In these heights, gravity followed the whims of the Archons rather than natural law, allowing their courts to gather on surfaces that faced in directions that had no names. Windows opened onto vistas of burning worlds and the cold depths of the Webway, their view shifting according to the observer's darkest desires. The very air tasted of ozone and anticipation, charged with the psychic residue of countless acts of calculated cruelty. Every archway, every sculpted gargoyle, every shimmering floor tile projected power with the subtle efficiency of a blade drawn across silk, beautiful, terrible, and utterly without mercy. Below the aristocratic heights, the nexus sprawled like a vast neural network through the city's core, its markets and trading halls pulsing with the dark commerce that kept Commorragh alive. Here, the practical business of suffering was conducted with the casual efficiency of any commercial district, yet the goods traded would drive lesser civilizations to madness. Soul cages hung from crystalline chains like wind chimes of the damned, their occupants visible as flickering shadows trapped in eternal torment. Flesh markets offered living canvas to Haemonculi clients, while weaponsmiths displayed splinter rifles whose crystalline ammunition sang with the voices of its victims. The market voids themselves were marvels of perverted engineering, their dimensions folded and refolded to accommodate crowds that numbered in the thousands millions, while occupying spaces no larger than cathedral squares. Soul traders hawked phials of distilled terror alongside amphorae of bottled rapture, their wares glittering like jewels in the sterile light of artificial suns. Auctioneers chanted in voices tuned to implant cravings, while stalls bristled with splinter shards cut to deliver precise agonies to precise anatomies. Walk too slowly and a contract would find you, its clauses whispering themselves into your mind until consent seemed like desire. Move too quickly, and you might be mistaken for prey, though in Commorragh, the distinction was mostly ceremonial. Deeper still, the witch arenas carved vast amphitheatres from the city's living rock, their acoustics designed not merely to carry sound, but to amplify the psychic resonance of terror and excitement. The crucible, greatest of the gladiatorial pits, descended through multiple dimensional layers like an inverted tower, its fighting floors existing in parallel realities that allowed spectators to witness battles from impossible angles. The crowds that gathered here were not mere observers, but participants in a ritual of collective feeding, their bloodlust and anticipation creating psychic harmonics that sustained both performers and audience alike. The arena architecture itself had been weaponized with exquisite precision. Razor-wire sculptures moved with predatory intelligence, seeking to snare unwary combatants in webs of monomolecular death. Gravity traps and phase shifts turned the fighting floors into three-dimensional puzzles, where a single misstep could send a warrior tumbling through dimensions. Gates disgorged beasts from forgotten moons, chimerae that flickered between realities, clawed fiends whose muscles bulged like knotted cables, flocks of razor-wing birds that turned the air itself into a weapon. Each scream in the stands registered as a tremor in the warp, and the arena's foundations were braided with psycho-reactive veins to capture, amplify, and refine the harvest of agony. In the industrial districts, the laboratories of the Haemonculi covens delved into architectural blasphemies that challenged the sanity of even their creators. These flesh forges existed in states of controlled dimensional flux, their internal geometries shifting to accommodate experiments that required impossible spaces. Vat chambers the size of cathedrals grew in pocket dimensions no larger than closets, while dissection theatres stretched across multiple reality layers to provide optimal viewing angles for procedures that violated every known law of biology and physics. The Haemonculi had learned to build with living materials that responded to their will, creating structures that were part architecture, part organism, and entirely devoted to the refinement of suffering. Corridors were lit by organs that had learned to glow under duress, their doors fashioned as lips that sealed with a hiss and tasted the names of those who passed. Walls of cultured bone grew in patterns that focused psychic energy like lenses, while neural networks threaded through the foundations allowed the laboratories themselves to learn from each experiment, adapting their configurations to maximize the yield of agony from future procedures. Yet even these horrors paled before the deepest reaches of Commorragh, where the Undercity and the realm of Elindrak stretched into dimensions that existed more as concept than place. The Undercity was a forgotten ruin, a decaying labyrinth of collapsed districts and abandoned structures where the very fabric of reality had grown frayed and unstable. Here, in perpetual twilight, the city's detritus accumulated like sediment from nightmares, broken portals that opened onto void storms, cul-de-sacs that ended in mirror-dark pools, districts that had fallen out of fashion and then out of reality entirely. Deeper still lay Elindrak, a shadow city that overlapped Commorragh's physical structure while remaining completely separate. This was the domain of the mandrakes, creatures of living shadow who flickered between dimensions like incarnate nightmares, their forms shifting between substance and void as they moved through architectural spaces that defied every attempt at mapping. The buildings in these depths were not constructed but grown from crystallized nightmares, their surfaces reflecting not light but fear itself. Even the Archons sent envoys wrapped in wards and weighted with bribes to this realm, and even then they were as likely to return as dusk was to keep its promises. The city's artificial suns provided illumination without warmth, their cold radiance designed not to comfort but to reveal every shadow where danger might lurk. These stellar engines had been crafted from the cores of dying stars, their nuclear fury contained within crystalline matrices that filtered their light through spectrums of despair. They cast shadows that moved independently of their sources, creating an ever-shifting maze of darkness and revelation that kept the city's inhabitants in a constant state of predatory alertness. Every aspect of Commorragh's impossible architecture served the same fundamental purpose: to create an environment where suffering could be maximised, refined and harvested with industrial efficiency. The city was not merely the home of the Drukhari, but their greatest creation, a monument to their philosophy of survival through cruelty made manifest in stone and shadow. Its streets were arteries that carried terror instead of blood, its buildings organs in a vast machine dedicated to the production of agony. Every promenade was a battlefield, every balcony a sniper's perch, every reflection an accomplice to some unspoken crime. As the Dark City continued to grow and evolve, absorbing new pocket dimensions and forgotten Webway nodes like a living organism feeding on reality itself, it became clear that Commorragh was more than architecture. It was philosophy given form, a living entity that breathed with the rhythm of its inhabitants' cruelty. The city had become the perfect expression of Drukhari nature, a place where existence itself was a form of exquisite torture, where every breath reminded its inhabitants that they had chosen to become the darkness they once fled. In the labyrinthine heart of their twilight realm, the Drukhari had built not just a sanctuary but a machine for manufacturing despair, a city that embodied their terrible answer to the question of survival in a universe that hungered for their souls. Yet architecture, no matter how perfectly cruel, could not exist without architects. The spires needed owners, the markets needed guarantors, the laboratories needed patrons. From this foundation of crystallized malice would arise the structures of power that would define not just the city's governance, but the very soul of Drukhari civilization itself. 3 pillars of authority, each more twisted than the last, each perfectly adapted to harvest suffering from a galaxy that had forgotten how to hope. From the crystallized malice of Commorragh's impossible architecture emerged the necessity for governance, yet governance among predators required forms unknown to any other civilization. The Dark City's spires demanded masters, its markets required guarantors, and its endless hunger needed organization. From this fundamental need arose not a single authority, but a trinity of competing philosophies, each offering a different answer to the question that haunted every Drukhari existence: how does one transform the mere act of survival into an art form worthy of the soul's price? These 3 pillars of power, the Cabals, the Wych Cults, and the Haemonculi, covens, emerged not as allies but as necessary rivals, each feeding upon different aspects of suffering, each indispensable to the others despite their eternal competition. Together, they created a society where every virtue of the ancient Eldari had been inverted, where traditional morality was replaced by the cruel arithmetic of necessity, and where cruelty itself became the highest form of wisdom. The Cabals formed the aristocratic backbone of this new order, evolving from the desperate alliances forged in Commorragh's earliest years into sophisticated military-political entities whose power rested upon a foundation of organized predation. These were not mere gangs or pirate crews, but warrior houses whose hierarchies were as rigid as they were deadly, their internal politics a venomous dance of assassination, intrigue, and strategic alliance that shifted like shadows in the Webway's depths. At the apex of each cabal stood an Archon, a figure whose authority flowed not from birthright but from their demonstrated ability to deliver suffering and slaves with artistic precision. These masters of violence were philosophers of predation, their long lives granting them strategic foresight that often seemed supernatural. Each Archon had risen through a labyrinth of betrayals and alliances, their ascension marked by the corpses of rivals and the screams of victims counted in the millions. They were tacticians who could orchestrate raids across multiple star systems, politicians who could navigate Commorragh's treacherous currents, and artists who understood that fear, properly orchestrated, sang louder in the warp than simple pain. Beneath each Archon, the Cabal hierarchy descended through ranks as sharp as blade edges. Drakons served as lieutenants and generals, their positions earned through demonstrations of tactical brilliance and personal lethality that left no room for doubt about their qualifications. They were the Archon's extended will, capable of independent command yet bound by chains of mutual interest that made betrayal a calculated risk rather than an inevitable outcome. Below them, Sybarites led squads of Cabalite warriors with the casual brutality of aristocrats, who had learned that respect was earned through fear and maintained through competence. The warriors themselves formed the professional core of Cabal power, soldiers whose loyalty was purchased not with coin, but with the promise of shared suffering and the opportunity to inflict their own pain upon the galaxy's lesser species. Their splinter rifles sang with crystalline voices as they fired, each shot calculated not merely to kill, but to terrorize. Their tactical doctrine built around the principle that a village taken at dawn yielded less psychic resonance than a world raked by midnight rumors of approaching terror. Power cohered into names that became threats whispered across the galaxy. The cabal of the Black Heart learned logistics as a language of domination, turning supply lines into leash and collar for lesser houses. The Obsidian Rose perfected armories as galleries, their weapons masterpieces of range and reliability. The Poisoned Tongue made slander a strategic asset, collapsing rivals with whispers more lethal than blades. The Flayed Skull ruled the skies above Commorragh's arteries, their raider prows etched with hunting sigils as they moved through traffic like sharks among herring. Yet the Cabals, for all their martial sophistication, could not alone nourish the Dark City's appetite for spectacle, nor could they refine raw suffering into the psychic sustenance that kept the soul thirst at bay. For this, a different philosophy emerged, one that understood pain not merely as currency, but as liturgy, combat not as tool but as worship. The witch cults raised their amphitheatres like temples, their performers serving as priestesses of a faith written in blood and razor wire. To the witches, violence was theatre, theatre was ritual, and ritual was nourishment for both performer and audience. They elevated lethality into choreography, transforming the arena floors into stages where death became art and agony became prayer. Succubi presided as high priestesses of the scream, each a paragon of grace whose blade work transcended mere technique, to become something approaching the divine. Their courts were gatherings of living weapons, witches who danced through combat like poems written in motion, their acrobatic lethality a testament to skill refined beyond the boundaries of natural possibility. In the great arenas of Commorragh, these warrior artists performed their deadly liturgies before crowds that numbered in the millions. Hydra gauntlets raked monomolecular lattices through the air, razor flails traced spirals that diced certainty into meat, while shard nets and impalers turned momentum into mantrap. Combat drugs with names like Grave Lotus, Serpentine, and Adrenalite were sacraments tailored to each performer's signature cruelty, their effects measured not in enhancement, but in the purity of sensation they provided. The cult of strife minted legends with every duel, their warriors competing not merely for victory, but for the perfect expression of violence as art. The Red Grief worshipped velocity as divinity, their fighters moving with speeds that made thought seem sluggish. The Cursed Blade embraced volatility so complete that survival itself became proof of cosmic favour. Each cult developed its own aesthetic, its own interpretation of the sacred dance between predator and prey. At the apex of this philosophy stood figures like Lelith Hesperax, the undisputed queen of the arenas whose blade work had transcended skill to become something that challenged the very laws of physics. She fought without armour, her naked flesh a canvas upon which she painted victory after victory, her survival a testament to perfection so refined that observers wept even as they cheered for more blood. To watch her fight was to witness cruelty elevated to art, violence transformed into beauty so terrible that it left permanent scars upon the soul. Yet beyond the arenas, the cult's influence spread through every level of Drukhari society. Reavers skimmed the city's air lanes like wasps, their grave talons snatching victims mid-scream while their engines howled in harmonics designed to stoke panic. Hellions ruled the bad heights on skyboards scabbed with trophies, riots blooming in their wake like night-flowering plants. Scourges, mercenary pariahs with purchased wings, sold altitude to any purse, their deadliest contracts penned in arena greenrooms where debts were measured in ovations rather than coin. Completing this unholy trinity were the Haemonculus covens, the true architects of Commorragh's most profound horrors and the keepers of its deepest secrets. These ancient, twisted beings were the Dark City's memory keepers, its resurrection merchants, and its ultimate arbiters of what constituted the perfect expression of agony. They were antiquarians of suffering, archivists of anatomy, and accountants of immortality whose knowledge stretched back to before the fall itself. The Haemonculi had transcended the limitations of natural form through millennia of self-experimentation, their bodies rebuilt and refined until they became living testaments to their philosophy of biological manipulation. They were surgeons who operated without anesthesia, not from cruelty but from scientific necessity, understanding that consciousness was the crucial element that transformed mere tissue into the canvas for their art. Their laboratories were galleries of impossible biology, where flesh was sculpted like clay and pain was refined into its purest essence. In their halls hummed catastrophe catalogued and codified, each experiment indexed in a taxonomy of suffering that stretched back through the ages. Urian Rakarth's Prophets of Flesh had codified resurrection into service contract, turning death itself into merely another medium for artistic expression. The Dark Creed weaponized terror as a transmissible faith, while the Coven of 12 perfected didactic mutilation until each scar could be read like scripture by those educated in their methods. They alone held the keys to rebirth, their soul traps glittering like malign constellations in vaults where stolen essence awaited expenditure. Clone flesh lay in ranked sarcophagi, a multitude of sleeping masks for future betrayals, while their knowledge of resurrection techniques made them indispensable to every Archon and Succubus who valued their continued existence. An Archon did not merely pay a coven for their services, he tithed a portion of his identity, securing continuity in a world where trust was rarer than pain. Their creations served as both artwork and instrument. Racks shambled through the laboratories with surgical implements fused to their flesh, their minds hollowed out and refilled with specialized knowledge that made them living tools perfectly adapted to their master's needs. Grotesques lumbered like mobile fortresses of muscle and bone, their forms sculpted for maximum intimidation. Talos and Kronos pain engines drifted through Commorragh's districts like predatory altars, harvesting agony with machine devotion while their forms testified to the Coven's mastery over the boundaries between flesh and mechanism. Between these three pillars stretched contracts written in thorn and glass, agreements that bound them together even as they competed for dominance. A cabal promised fresh captives and political cover. A cult promised spectacle that multiplied each captive's psychic yield. A coven promised continuity that made ambition survivable across the centuries. Real space raids became joint enterprises, raider flotillas bearing the colours of an Archon, holds fitted with arena pre-shows, surgical theatres folded into hulls like parasitic organs designed to maximise the harvest of terror. The hierarchy that emerged from this trinity was as elegant as it was deadly. Courts clustered around Archons like poisonous flowers, Lemaian assassins with venom whispers, Slith bodyguards coiled in calculated loyalty, Medusae drifting like captured thoughts, Urguls sniffing fear along marble routes. Succubi issued challenges inscribed on razors, where refusal was confession and acceptance was wagering blood as currency. Haemonculi arrived as honoured terrors, reminders that in Commorragh, death was merely a courtesy extended to the irrelevant. This trinity of torment created a civilization where every virtue had been inverted with surgical precision. Compassion became a fatal vulnerability, mercy a form of suicide, and empathy a weakness that predators learned to target with clinical efficiency. Cruelty was wisdom, calculated betrayal marked genius, and the systematic infliction of suffering represented the highest form of artistic expression. The older Eldari Empire's values had not merely been abandoned but consciously perverted, each noble ideal twisted into its perfect opposite. Yet beneath this terrifying efficiency lay a fundamental tension that would define Drukhari civilization for millennia to come. The Trinity provided structure and purpose, but it could not address the deeper philosophical implications of their existence. Each successful raid, each perfect performance, each masterwork of fleshcraft only delayed the ultimate reckoning with the void that gnawed at their souls. They had created a society capable of harvesting suffering with industrial efficiency, but the hunger they sought to feed grew stronger with each feeding, demanding ever greater refinements of cruelty, ever more sophisticated methods of extracting agony from their victims. The cabals, cults and covens had given the Drukhari the tools to survive, but survival without growth was merely another form of death. In the shadows of their own success, new hungers were beginning to stir, hungers that would challenge not just their methods but the very foundations of their philosophy. The Trinity of Torment had answered the question of how to organize predators, but it had not yet addressed the deeper mystery that haunted every Drukhari heart. What happens to those who choose to become the darkness, when the darkness itself grows hungry for something more than mere survival. In the labyrinthine depths of Commorragh, where every shadow concealed a blade and every breath tasted of ozone and terror, the three pillars of power continued their eternal dance of competition and cooperation. They had created a civilization that was simultaneously stable and dynamic, its internal tensions providing the energy necessary for growth, while its mutual dependencies prevented any single faction from achieving total dominance. It was a society built upon the principle that cruelty could be elevated to art, that predation could become philosophy, and that the act of survival could be transformed into something worthy of the soul's price. Yet the question that had driven them into exile remained unanswered, whispering through the endless corridors of their dark city like a promise of reckonings yet to come. The trinity of power that governed Commorragh represented more than political organisation. It was the physical manifestation of a deeper philosophy born from existential terror that gnawed at every Drukhari heart. For beneath all their sophistication, their artistry, their calculated hierarchies, lay a truth so fundamental it shaped every breath they drew. They were dying, slowly and inexorably, consumed from within by the very god their ancestors had birthed through cosmic excess. The soul thirst was not metaphor but measurable reality, as quantifiable as pulse or blood pressure, yet infinitely more terrible in its implications. The hunger manifested as a void that expanded like spiritual cancer, a pressure like cold fingers closing around the heart that tightened with each passing moment. Unlike mortal appetites, it could not be satisfied through consumption. Only the psychic agony of others produced the resonant counterflow that temporarily cooled the gnawing emptiness. This was Slaanesh's eternal claim upon their essence, the Dark Prince feeding slowly, savouring each morsel of their souls like wine aged in suffering, and every Drukhari woke to this reality, lived with it, bargained against it in the arithmetic of their nights. From this fundamental terror, the Drukhari had developed a science of torment that elevated suffering to an art form so refined it challenged the boundaries of physics and psychology. Their techniques for extracting maximum psychic resonance would astound Imperial Inquisitors who considered themselves masters of pain. The Haemonculi quantified the unquantifiable, building lacrimal indices to grade victims' tears, sorrow graphs to chart the collapse of will, and harmonic arrays that captured terror in crystalline matrices. Pain engines learned to hum at frequencies that drew fear from marrow, while splinter toxins were revised generation after generation, tuned to grant every sensation except death. Each faction of the Trinity approached this necessity through their own specialized methodology. The Cabals transformed the soul thirst into military doctrine. Their raids measured not in territory conquered, but in screams harvested. Archons employed cupbearers who carried amaranthine vials sealed with soul keys, to be sipped when conversation dulled or threats sharpened. Warriors received rations of distilled fear before sorties, the terror sharpening senses and aligning will for the hunt ahead. Their entire tactical philosophy revolved around the principle that a village taken at dawn yielded less psychic resonance than a world raked by midnight rumours of approaching horror. The Wych Cults elevated the hunger into liturgy, their arena performances serving as mass-feeding rituals where performer and audience participated in collective sustenance. Succubi inhaled perfumes compounded from audience panic, each breath a sacrament that stretched focus into preternatural grace. The acoustics of their amphitheatres were designed not merely to carry sound, but to amplify psychic resonance, converting bloodlust into potable nectar through chorus amplifiers that laced the rafters. Combat drugs with names like Grave Lotus and Serpentine became communion wafers, in a faith where violence was prayer and death was offering. The homunculus covens approached the soul thirst with clinical precision, treating it as phenomenon to be studied, manipulated and refined. Their laboratories bristled with soul siphons ranging from handheld instruments to city block arrays capable of draining entire populations. Kronos engines administered extraction through caress rather than blade, inducing climactic terror whose resonance nourished entire platoons. Specialized chambers could bottle screams like vintage wine, their contents catalogued by species, age, and emotional purity. In their flesh forges, placards read, "Do not kill," until the pain has taught you everything, transforming murder into education and agony into curriculum. What began as desperate treatment became systematic theology. The Drukhari developed an entire pharmacology of suffering, where etiquette and medicine became indistinguishable. Soul traps, obsidian prisms etched with blasphemous runes, snared spiritual echoes at the moment of death, bottling essence like captured lightning. Victims were not always mutilated. Sometimes they were cultivated, peasants rescued and returned to ferment years of dread before the next harvest. Planetary governors fed falsified reports whose consequences bloomed into sector-wide despair. The hunger shaped their very language until failure became famine, success became vintage, and prayer took the form of bargains whispered in the dark. Haemonculi debated terroir in symposiums where vintners' fields were worlds and weather was war. Their power grid hummed with stolen hymns from conquered tongues, while markets traded in commodities that would drive lesser civilizations to madness. Phials of distilled terror, amphorae of bottled rapture, soul cages hanging like wind chimes of the damned. Yet this sophisticated apparatus of survival came with costs that compounded across millennia. The soul thirst created its own temporal prison, trapping the Drukhari in an eternal present where they could not plan beyond the next feeding, could not conceive of futures that did not involve systematic brutalization. Their immortality transformed from gift to curse because it meant infinity of hunger stretching ahead without hope of resolution. Each resurrection from coven vats returned bodies renewed, but souls remembering the mouth that waited, each century demanding richer vintages to still the tremors. The hunger also poisoned every relationship, making trust impossible, when survival required willingness to sacrifice anyone for temporary sustenance. Love became liability, family bonds dissolved under pressure, as parents and children learned to see each other first as hunting allies, second as potential prey. The oldest Drukhari displayed a hollow quality, suggesting something essential had been lost in endless cycles of feeding, their capacity to dream migrating from hope to method until they became artists of single medium, repeating masterpieces each night to buy mornings where nothing new awaited. The mathematics were brutal in their clarity. Each act of cruelty strengthened the Dark Prince whose birth had damned them, making them unwilling servants to a god they refused to name in prayer. They fed Slaanesh even as they fled its embrace, trapped in cosmic paradox where resistance to damnation took the form of serving damnation itself. Their philosophy emerged simple, terrible, utterly logical. Better to be predator than prey, better to damn others than accept their own extinction. This was not sadism, but civic duty in their inverted morality. Waste became the sole sin, incompetence the only crime. A raid leaving corpses cooling in silence was castigated as professional failure, a performance ending too soon, an insult to audience hunger, surgery killing subjects without extracting secrets, mere malpractice. In Commorragh, ethics had been inverted into economy, optimize agony, allocate terror, accrue days against damnation. From this foundation of necessary evil, this arithmetic of survival written in screams and measured in heartbeats stolen from eternity, would emerge the figure who promised to transform their desperate philosophy into systematic dominion. The soul thirst had taught them to be predators, but predators required leadership, organization, vision extending beyond mere feeding. In the shadows of their own success, new hungers stirred, hungers for power, for control, for the kind of authority that could organize chaos into empire. The Dark City had learned to survive, but survival without growth remained merely elaborate suicide. What Commorragh needed was not another philosopher of pain, but an architect of ambition, someone who understood that in a realm of predators, the greatest predator was not the strongest, but the most indispensable. That figure was already moving through the city's lower reaches, his name not yet spoken in the courts above, his genius not yet recognized by those who would soon kneel before it. The soul thirst had created the Drukhari, but it would take something more than hunger to forge them into an empire worthy of their terrible potential. From the philosophical necessity of the soul thirst had emerged a civilization capable of harvesting suffering with industrial efficiency. Yet for all their sophistication in the arts of predation, the Drukhari remained fundamentally fractured. The trinity of power, cabals, cults, and covens provided structure and method, but Commorragh's energies were dissipated in endless internal conflicts, its hunger as likely to devour itself as any external prey. What the Dark City needed was not another philosopher of pain but an architect of ambition, someone who understood that true power lay not in being the strongest predator, but in becoming indispensable to all predators. That figure would emerge from the most unlikely origins, proving that in a realm where birth meant nothing and survival meant everything, intelligence was the ultimate weapon. In the sump glooms beneath Commorragh's market voids, where existence was measured in heartbeats, and hope was a luxury that killed faster than despair, a nameless slave learned the fundamental arithmetic of the Dark City before he learned to speak his own name. Born without lineage or privilege, cast into bondage in the fighting pits where slave gladiators died for aristocratic amusement, the child who would become Asdrubal Vecht absorbed his first and most crucial lesson. In Commorragh, weakness was not merely disadvantage but death sentence, and the only currency that mattered was the ability to make oneself useful to those with power. Where other slaves learned to endure or die with what dignity they could muster, Vecht learned to observe with the precision of a natural philosopher. He watched the arena crowds, cataloguing which bloodshed drew applause and which drew bored silence. He studied the guards, noting their fears and desires with clinical detachment. He analysed the betting patterns of nobles who wagered on slave lives, understanding that their apparent randomness concealed predictable appetites for specific forms of violence. Most importantly, he learned to read the political currents that flowed through Commorragh like invisible tides, recognizing that information was the one resource that could not be taken by force alone. His ascension began not with blade work, but with whispers, each carefully planted word a seed that would bloom into obligation. A guard warned of an assassination attempt found himself promoted beyond his modest expectations. A minor Archon provided with intelligence about a rival's weakness discovered unexpected victory in the next raiding season. A succubus offered details about her enemy's vulnerabilities, saw her arena performances draw larger crowds, her victories earn more thunderous applause. Vecht made himself valuable without making himself visible, his influence spreading through the city's power structures like toxin through blood, each favour creating debt, each debt becoming leverage, each act of assistance binding the recipient more tightly to an unseen patron. The genius of his method lay in its revolutionary subtlety. Where traditional Drukhari politics relied on the crude mathematics of fear and force, Vecht employed the far more sophisticated calculus of indispensability. He discovered the schedules of portal currents that even seasoned Archons believed random, selling predictions to rival raiding parties on opposite sides of the Webway, knowing each would win against some third foe and attribute their success to luck rather than intelligence. He brokered truce feasts where poison was expected and therefore not used, and because it was not used, the guests owed him their survival. Piece by quiet piece, he laid the foundations of what would become the Cabal of the Black Heart, not a banner raised in conquest, but a ledger of accumulated obligations, not an oath sworn in blood, but a web of debts that made resistance increasingly unthinkable. The Cabal of the Black Heart became his instrument through seduction rather than seizure. This ancient house had fallen on hard times, its leadership grown complacent, its warriors demoralized by failed raids that had cost them prestige and resources. Vecht approached them not as conqueror, but as consultant, offering strategies that transformed their failures into foundations for unprecedented success. Under his guidance, they began to specialize not in simple slave-taking, but in the far more sophisticated art of systematic destabilization, identifying target worlds not for immediate value, but for strategic importance in larger conflicts, orchestrating campaigns where a governor assassinated here and a supply convoy destroyed there created cascading failures that turned entire sectors into hunting preserves where panic bred like plague. The old aristocracy watched with growing unease as this upstart slave-turned-strategist accumulated influence through methods they could neither understand nor counter. They saw his successes but not the architecture that made them possible, recognized his growing power but not the web of dependencies that sustained it. Their attempts to eliminate him revealed the true extent of his genius. Each assassination attempt failed not because of superior bodyguards, but because the would-be assassins discovered they needed him alive more than they wanted him dead. Portal keys changed hands according to music only he could hear. Traffic edicts were issued in the names of councils that no longer met, and Haemonculi found their shipments expedited with permissions, stamped before ink was dry. all bearing the same polite signature, a heart cracked and filled with shadow. The Night of Bleeding Razors marked the culmination of Vekt's patient campaign, a symphony of betrayal so perfectly orchestrated that its victims died believing themselves masters of their own fate. The evening began as a reconciliation banquet, a masque proclaiming the restoration of ancient privileges, its invitations engraved on soul silver and sealed with the private glyphs of the great houses. Each guest arrived certain they were the true patron of events, each convinced that the night would see their rivals humbled and their own position secured. At the feast's height, light shifted across spectrums known only to certain homunculi, shadow fields sang with synchronized static, and the killing began with the precision of a choreographed performance. The assassins who struck were household guards, lovers, rivals' debtors, and grateful beneficiaries, each convinced they had chosen the moment, each weapon delivered earlier that week by different couriers bearing the same cracked heart sigil. House Ilithian fell to poison supplied by House Krylak, who in turn were destroyed by House Celian, who found themselves facing the combined might of houses they had believed were their allies. Each death was a note in Vekt's grand composition, each betrayal a carefully planned movement in a symphony that played out across the Dark City's spires and shadows. The beauty of his orchestration lay not merely in its effectiveness, but in its elegance. The old aristocracy destroyed itself while he remained apparently uninvolved, a concerned observer offering condolences to widows and counsel to survivors. When the blood finally dried and the screaming faded, Vekt emerged not as conqueror seizing a throne in triumph, but as the only figure capable of preventing the city from tearing itself apart in the aftermath. He announced that the Cabal of the Black Heart would serve as guarantor of the Order, that the Covens would have unobstructed corridors for resurrection rites, provided they registered their work through his offices, and that the Wych Cults would receive exclusive raiding windows if they coordinated their spectacles with his logistics. He presented domination as administration, tyranny as maintenance, and the city sighed in relief as it slid the collar over its own neck. His consolidation of power followed the same principles that had guided his ascension. Not domination, but integration. Not fear, but necessity. The surviving houses found themselves offered positions in a new hierarchy, where their traditional privileges were preserved, but their independence was quietly eliminated. From that night forward, tribute flowed like blood through arteries. He alone owned, every cabal tithed captives and coin, every cult tithed ovations and terror yield, every coven tithed continuity held in escrow as insurance against ambition. The price of defiance was never public mutilation, for Vekt preferred something quieter, a raiding window that closed a heartbeat too soon, a portal that reopened onto a void storm, a resurrection that proceeded flawlessly but returned a rival with a microscopic flaw only they could feel, a shiver in the soul that eroded certainty over centuries. The transformation was gradual but inexorable. Where Commorragh had once been a collection of warring fiefdoms consuming its own energies in endless internal conflicts, it became a unified predator state whose hunger was directed outward with results that shocked even its inhabitants. Raids that had once been desperate scavenging expeditions became strategic strikes, coordinated across multiple star systems. The soul thirst that had driven them merely to survive was transformed into an engine of conquest that made survival seem almost incidental to their larger purpose. Intelligence networks provided advance warning of Imperial fleet movements, chaos incursions and orc migrations, allowing the Dark City's raiders to strike at moments of maximum vulnerability with precision that seemed almost supernatural. Vekt's methods revolutionized Drukhari warfare by applying the same principles that had secured his political dominance. Where other Archons planned raids, he orchestrated campaigns spanning decades and multiple sectors. More importantly, he understood that fear multiplied exponentially when properly managed. A single raid executed with perfect timing could terrorize a dozen worlds, while a dozen uncoordinated raids might pass unnoticed. Under his guidance, the Dark City learned to harvest not just individual suffering but systematic despair, turning entire regions of space into carefully tended gardens of terror, where panic was cultivated like a crop. The Supreme Overlord's greatest achievement, however, was not conquest but continuity. In a civilization where immortality could be purchased from homunculus vats but trust could never be bought, where resurrection was common but loyalty was rare, Vect had created something unprecedented, a stable power structure that survived not because it was feared, but because it was indispensable. His rule rested not on the crude foundation of superior force, but on the sophisticated architecture of mutual dependency and shared interest. He survived because he never needed to be where he appeared, his palaces becoming palimpsests of traps, where corridors rewrote themselves around intruders and shadows moved with armed minds. When assassins found him, they found him ready. When they killed him, they learned they had not. His court reflected this philosophy, gathering beings so specialized in their particular forms of service that they became living extensions of his will. Lahamayan, poisoners whispered death into wine cups, their loyalty purchased with promises of ever more sophisticated toxins to perfect. Eslith bodyguards coiled in calculated devotion, their protection guaranteed by contracts that made their survival dependent on his own. Medusi drifted like captured thoughts through his audiences, their psychic emanations reading intentions before they could crystallize into action. Each relationship was crafted to create mutual dependency rather than mere dominance, each alliance structured to make betrayal more costly than loyalty. In the grim darkness of the far future, Asdrubal Vect had achieved something that challenged the fundamental assumptions of Drukhari society. He had proven that intelligence was indeed the ultimate weapon, that cunning could triumph over strength, and that a former slave could become the absolute master of a city of masters. His transformation of Commorragh from chaotic refuge into unified predator state marked the evolution of Drukhari civilization from desperate survival to systematic conquest. The soul thirst remained, gnawing at every heart, but under Vect's guidance it no longer drove them merely to feed. It drove them to dominate, to expand, to perfect the art of organized suffering until the entire galaxy became their hunting preserve. The Supreme Overlord's reign would define not merely the Dark City's politics, but its very soul, proving that in a universe where cruelty was currency and mercy was madness, the vision to see beyond the next feeding could build an empire worthy of their terrible potential. From the slave pits of Low Commorragh to the crystal throne of absolute authority, his journey embodied the Drukhari philosophy made manifest. That necessity could forge genius, that survival could become art, and that even the damned could choose the nature of their damnation. Yet this mastery of predation would soon face its ultimate test, for an empire built on suffering required not just the ability to inflict pain, but the methods to deliver it with maximum efficiency. The Dark City had learned to organize its hunger, but hunger without expression remained merely appetite. What Commorragh needed now was not philosophy but practice, not theory but the perfected art of war itself. Under Vect's orchestration, the transformation of Commorragh from fractured refuge to unified predator state demanded more than political consolidation. It required the evolution of warfare itself. The scattered raiding parties that had once scavenged like carrion feeders were forged into something far more terrible. A military machine that elevated violence to art form, terror to science, and predation to philosophy made manifest in blade and shadow. The Drukhari did not wage war in any sense that other species would recognize. They performed it, each engagement a carefully choreographed ballet where death was the dancer and fear was the music that guided every lethal step. Their military doctrine flowed from their fundamental nature as predators rather than conquerors, a distinction that shaped every aspect of their approach to combat. Where other species sought territory, resources, or strategic advantage, the Drukhari hunted for prey, living beings whose suffering could feed the soul thirst, whose terror could be refined into psychic sustenance, whose screams could buy another day's reprieve from Slaanesh's eternal hunger. This philosophical foundation transformed traditional military thinking, creating tactical principles that prioritize psychological impact over material gain, speed over strength, and precision over overwhelming force. Speed became their sacrament, surprise their scripture. Raider transports skimmed through real space like sharks through blood-warm water, their hulls crackling with shadow fields that bent light and hope alike. These vessels were not merely fast, but supernaturally swift, their anti-gravitic engines tuned to frequencies that made sound itself lag behind their passage. The shadow fields that sheathed their craft represented technology elevated to artistry, defensive systems that protected not through armor but through deception, energy matrices that twisted photons around the hull, until the raiders became visible only as suggestions of menace, dark shapes that existed more as possibility than presence. When the sky tore and the raiders fell, their victims were already halfway to terror. The first blow was always isolation, vox nets howling, then dying, Auspex returning clean horizons until the horizons split, and disgorged frost-edged silhouettes moving at impossible speed. Raiders deployed their cargo of death with drill book precision, Cabalite warriors fanning into alleys and thoroughfares with movements that flowed like liquid malice. Their splinter rifles spat crystalline toxins that transformed armour into agony, each shard designed not merely to penetrate, but to educate its target in the precise taxonomy of pain. The toxins were masterworks of homunculus artistry, compounds that turned death into extended symphony, each drop calibrated to deliver maximum suffering while preserving consciousness, to appreciate the experience. Darklight lances represented the opposite philosophy, weapons that erased matter with casual contempt, their beams unmaking reality at the molecular level. When Darklight touched armour, flesh, or spirit, it did not destroy but simply convinced existence that the target had never been. The psychological impact was profound. Defenders who witnessed their comrades unmade by Darklight learned that in facing the Drukhari, even death was not guaranteed, only erasure from the memory of the universe itself. The Wych Cults transformed contact into spectacle, their performers leaping from raiders into the living geometry of the battlefield. Witches danced through Lassfire with grace that challenged physics, their movements guided by combat drugs that transformed reflexes into prophecy and pain into pleasure. Razor flails hummed poems of dismemberment, Hydra gauntlets unfurled skeins of monomolecular caress, while shardnets and impalers snared momentum and turned it into public confession. Their acrobatic lethality was prayer offered to the crowd's bloodlust, each pirouette between death and survival, a verse in the liturgy of violence that sustained both performer and audience back in Commorragh's arenas. Above the carnage, reavers drew contrails of cruelty across the sky, their jet bikes threading needle mazes no machine should survive. They strafed crowds with blade veins and cluster caltrops, turning intersections into threshing floors, their grav talons hooking fleeing figures and yanking them screaming into the slipstream. Scourges descended like fallen seraphs, their purchased pinions flaring with captured light, heat lances and haywire blasters plucking the teeth from armoured response with jeweler's delicacy. These mercenary pariahs had traded their souls for altitude, their loyalty purchased with promises of ever more sophisticated methods of aerial assassination. When resistance stiffened, the tone changed rather than the doctrine. Pain engines drifted like floating altars through the chaos, Talos bristling with surgical malevolence, Kronos humming with empathic feeders that drank fear as easily as blood. These monstrous creations of the homunculus covens harvested resonance that streamed along psychoreactive filaments into caskets, waiting in the raiders' holds, converting agony into potable sustenance with industrial efficiency. Every action was calculated to multiply itself psychologically. Terror preceded contact, humiliation accompanied capture, and rumour survived the retreat. The Drukhari understood that fear was a transmissible disease, that panic could be cultivated like a crop, and that a population's will to resist could be harvested as efficiently as their physical lives. They struck at the innocent before the armed, the unprepared before the ready, the defenceless before the dangerous, not from cowardice but from efficiency, a coldly rational understanding that a terrified population yielded more psychic sustenance than a defeated army. Their targeting priorities inverted traditional military logic entirely. Hospitals and schools drew their attention not for strategic value but for psychological impact. Planetary governors would receive gifts months before raids. Beautiful sculptures that screamed when exposed to light, elegant music boxes that played the death songs of extinct species, mirrors that reflected not the viewer but their deepest fears made manifest. These psychological assaults preceded physical invasion, creating climates of terror that made actual conquest almost anticlimactic. Withdrawal was itself an art form, a reverse ballet choreographed to leave the impression of omnipotence. Raiders skimmed backward through streets that seemed to narrow behind them as if the city itself had leaned to assist, while portals reopened onto Webway arteries whose scheduling had been negotiated with promises written in blood. The Drukhari vanished not when defeated, but when their harvest was complete, leaving behind populations that would spend generations jumping at shadows, their terror continuing to feed the Dark City long after the raiders had returned to Commorragh's depths. Their greatest victories were measured not in ground taken, but in souls stolen, not in enemies defeated, but in screams extracted. They were the nightmare that struck without warning and vanished without trace, leaving only emptiness where hope once lived. Each perfect raid brought temporary reprieve from the soul thirst, but it also highlighted the fundamental tension that gnawed at their civilization, that their survival depended not merely on being predators, but on serving the very entity they claimed to flee. In the grim darkness of the far future, the Drukhari had perfected the art of war as performance, terror as science, and cruelty as philosophy. Yet even this razor's edge of military precision could not address the deeper contradictions that haunted their existence. Their mastery of predation was complete, but mastery without growth remained merely elaborate suicide. In the shadows of their triumph, new hungers were beginning to stir, hungers that would challenge not just their methods, but the very foundations of their philosophy of survival. For in a civilization built upon the harvesting of suffering, the greatest threat might not come from those they hunted, but from the artists who had learned to refine agony into its purest, most terrible forms. The perfection of Drukhari warfare demanded more than tactical brilliance or technological superiority. It required the systematic transformation of death itself into merely another medium for artistic expression. In a civilization where the most skilled warriors, cunning Archons and agile succubi could fall in battle, the loss of irreplaceable expertise threatened the very foundations of their predatory society. This fundamental need for continuity, combined with their endless hunger for refined suffering, gave rise to the third and perhaps most terrifying pillar of Drukhari power, the homunculus covens, flesh sculptors who had elevated pain to science and made death their most obedient servant. In the deepest laboratories of Commorragh, where screams echoed in frequencies that mortal ears could not perceive, and the very architecture breathed with malevolent intelligence, the Haemonculi practiced their ancient art with devotion that bordered on the religious. These master fleshcrafters were far more than mere torturers or surgeons. They were the Dark City's memory keepers, its resurrection merchants, and its architects of impossible agony, who served as living bridges between what the Eldari had been before the fall and what the Drukhari had become in their desperate flight from damnation. The Haemonculi themselves had transcended the boundaries of natural form through millennia of self-experimentation, their bodies becoming living testaments to their philosophy of biological manipulation. They wore flesh like clothing that could be altered at whim, additional limbs sprouting from torsos like surgical instruments made animate, while sensory organs clustered in impossible arrangements that allowed them to perceive pain in spectrums unknown to baseline anatomy. These ancient beings were surgeons who operated without anesthesia not from cruelty, but from scientific necessity, understanding that consciousness was the crucial element that transformed mere tissue into canvas for their grotesque artistry. Their laboratories existed in states of controlled dimensional flux, vat chambers the size of cathedrals growing in pocket dimensions no larger than closets, while dissection theatres stretched across multiple reality layers to provide optimal viewing angles for procedures that violated every known law of biology and physics. The very architecture had been weaponized with living materials that responded to their will, corridors lit by organs that had learned to glow under duress, doors fashioned as lips that sealed with wet sounds and tasted the names of those who passed through their threshold. Walls of cultured bone that focused psychic energy like lenses, while neural networks threaded through the foundations allowed the laboratories themselves to learn from each experiment. Within these halls of living horror, their creation served as both artwork and instrument. Racks shambled through corridors paved in crystallized screams, their minds hollowed out and refilled with specialized knowledge that made them living tools perfectly adapted to their master's needs. Bone saws grew from finger bones, surgical needles sprouted from palms, and their eyes had been replaced with microscopic lenses that could perceive cellular structures with magnifications that made atoms visible. Grotesques lumbered past vats of bubbling flesh, their massive forms sculpted for maximum intimidation and utility. Living siege engines whose muscles were layered in configurations, that provided strength beyond natural possibility, while their nervous systems had been rewired to process pain as pleasure. The true power of the Covens, however, lay in their mastery over death itself. They alone possessed the knowledge to cheat the finality that haunted every Drukhari, the inescapable spiritual consumption by Slaanesh upon true death. Through intricate rituals and forbidden technologies, they could capture a dying Drukhari's soul essence within soul traps, crystalline prisons that shielded it from the Dark Prince's hungry maw, while clone flesh grew in numbered sarcophagi, organs humming with borrowed hymns, nerves tuned to accept returning essence. Yet resurrection was never restoration. Memories gained new seams, appetites drifted, reflexes stuttered, each return from death bearing the subtle marks of coven artistry. Their covenant with Drukhari society was elegantly simple in its terrible implications. Serve and we will rebuild you. Betray, and we will remember you in ways that make damnation seem like mercy. This promise of resurrection made them indispensable to every Archon and succubus who valued their continued existence. Yet the prices they demanded went far beyond mere payment. Each resurrection required not just resources but the surrender of memories, experiences, and aspects of identity that the Haemonculi found scientifically interesting. Clients who returned from death often discovered they had been improved in subtle ways, reflexes enhanced, pain thresholds adjusted, or sensory capabilities expanded, modifications that served the Coven's research agenda while binding the recipient ever more tightly to their patrons. From their workshops emerged the pain engines that had revolutionized Drukhari warfare. Talos and Kronos engines drifted through Commorragh's districts like predatory altars, their forms blending mechanical precision with biological horror in ways that challenged observers to determine where technology ended and living tissue began. These constructs harvested agony with efficiency that would astound Imperial tech priests, their empathic feeders drinking fear as easily as blood, while psycho-reactive filaments channeled the collected suffering into storage matrices that could preserve anguish like vintage wine. Each pain engine was a unique creation, its configuration reflecting both the Haemonculus's artistic preferences and the specific requirements of its intended deployment. The Haemonculi served as guardians of knowledge that stretched back to the Empire's Golden Age, techniques for manipulating matter and energy that had been forbidden even before Slaanesh's birth. In their vaults lay the accumulated wisdom of a civilization that had once touched the stars, now perverted into service of survival at any cost. They maintained careful hierarchies based not on political power, but on artistic achievement and scientific innovation, ancient masters gathering disciples who competed for the privilege of assisting in groundbreaking experiments that spanned decades or centuries. Their philosophy dressed itself in cold taxonomy. Pain became information, terror developed terroirs, and despair was catalogued by species and emotional purity. They explored the boundaries of sensation with the detached curiosity of scientists, pushing the limits of what sentient beings could endure while driven by the belief that in understanding agony, they could better understand the nature of existence itself. Some victims were cultivated for decades, their suffering refined through careful manipulation of hope and despair, while others were harvested in moments of orchestrated revelation when a life's lie was torn away so perfectly that the scream rang pure across realities. The Coven's influence permeated every aspect of Drukhari society through webs of dependency that made resistance increasingly unthinkable. Cabals relied on them for clone bodies and specialized combat drugs. Wych cults sought their expertise in enhancing performers' bodies and creating arena beasts, while even as Drubel Vect maintained a complex relationship with them, understanding that their knowledge of resurrection was the ultimate guarantor of his reign, while remaining acutely aware that their loyalty was to knowledge itself rather than any individual ruler. In their hands, flesh became clay infinitely malleable, pain became currency more valuable than souls, and death became merely another medium for their grotesque artistry. They were the keepers of the Dark City's deepest secrets, and the ultimate expression of Drukhari philosophy, that survival at any cost was not merely acceptable, but the highest form of wisdom. Their mastery of resurrection had created a civilization where death was postponement rather than conclusion, where the fallen could return to serve again, and where the accumulated expertise of millennia was preserved against the entropy that claimed lesser species. Yet the Haemonculi also embodied the fundamental paradox that haunted Drukhari existence. Their greatest triumph, the conquest of death itself, served the very entity they sought to escape, each resurrection feeding Slaanesh's hunger, while providing only temporary reprieve from the soul thirst. They had learned to transcend mortality, to reshape reality according to their will, and to extract sustenance from suffering with scientific precision. But their mastery came at a price that compounded with each passing millennium. They were trapped in an eternal present, where innovation served only the hunger that gnawed at their souls, where their greatest achievements strengthened their cosmic nemesis, and where growth meant only refinement of techniques for harvesting agony. In the deepest laboratories of Commorragh, where the boundaries between flesh and spirit dissolved under surgical precision, and ancient wisdom was perverted into service of necessity, the Haemonculi continued their work as memory and conscience, salvation and damnation of their civilization. They had proven that genius without restraint could achieve anything except the one thing it most desired: escape from the consequences of its own success. Their covenant with Drukhari society would endure as long as the soul thirst itself, for in a civilization built upon the harvesting of suffering, there would always be need for those who understood that agony could become art, death could become resurrection, and damnation itself could become the raw material for something approaching transcendence. Yet even their mastery of flesh and spirit could not address the fundamental tensions beginning to tear at the fabric of their society. The perfection they had achieved in resurrection and predation had created a civilization capable of surviving anything except the implications of its own success. In the shadows of their triumph, forces were stirring that would challenge not just their methods, but the very foundations upon which Commorragh had been built, forces that threatened to shatter the delicate balance between the trinity of power and expose the ultimate question the Drukhari had spent 10,000 years avoiding. What happens to predators when their perfect system of survival becomes the very thing that ensures their damnation? The mastery achieved by the homunculus covens, their conquest of death itself and perfection of resurrection techniques, had created an illusion of invulnerability that permeated every level of Drukhari society. Yet even in the deepest shadows of the Webway, where reality bent to their will and the laws of physics yielded to their architectural blasphemies, the galaxy's convulsions could not be held at bay forever. The Dark City had cultivated its isolation like a precious toxin, believing itself immune to the cosmic tides that swept through lesser civilizations, but the universe had found a way to deliver a truth they had spent 10 millennia learning to deny. The first tremors manifested as distortions in the portal currents, subtle irregularities that the Haemonculi dismissed as background fluctuations in the Webway's ancient matrices. Raiding parties returned with reports that seemed more like fever dreams than intelligence. Craft-world Eldar fighting with unprecedented desperation, their disciplined paths abandoned in favour of raw emotional intensity, human psychers screaming prophecies in tongues that predated their species, and across multiple sectors, a growing sense that reality itself was holding its breath in anticipation of something unprecedented. The Archons catalogued these anomalies with their characteristic clinical detachment, viewing them as opportunities for exploitation rather than warnings of approaching catastrophe. Their intelligence networks, so sophisticated in mapping the weaknesses of their prey, had failed to recognize the signs of something stirring within their own shattered species, a heresy of hope that challenged the fundamental premise upon which Commorragh had been built. The revelation came not through carefully cultivated informants or prophetic visions, but through the arena floors of the cult of strife, where death was performance and blood was sacrament. In the Crucible, that greatest of gladiatorial amphitheatres where millions gathered to witness violence elevated to art form, Yvraine faced her opponents with the casual grace that marked true mastery. The crowd anticipated another display of perfect lethality, another demonstration that in the realm of the Drukhari, even death could be choreographed to serve their aesthetic of cruelty. Instead, they witnessed something that challenged every assumption upon which their civilization rested. When the killing blow fell, Yvraine's death was not the clean conclusion that arena combat demanded, but a rupture that tore reality like tissue paper. Her dying scream became birth cry as something stirred within her failing flesh. Not the soul thirst that gnawed at every Drukhari heart, but its antithesis, a presence that spoke of endings made meaningful rather than merely final. The arena's acoustics, designed to amplify psychic resonance and convert bloodlust into spiritual sustenance, carried her transformation across dimensional barriers with effects that rippled through the Webway's deepest foundations. She rose not as the resurrected puppet of homunculus artistry, but as something unprecedented, the emissary of Ennead, the Eldari god of the dead whose awakening had been prophesied since the fall itself. Her presence in Commorragh was a violation of every natural law, a contradiction that the Dark City's reality anchors could not resolve. Where she walked, the artificial suns flickered with light that warmed rather than merely illuminated. Shadows shortened as if fleeing her approach, and the very air tasted of possibilities that the Drukhari had spent 10 millennia learning to forget. Reality tore like silk, then like sinew. In the instant of her death-birth, the arena became a lens that focused 10,000 years of Eldari longing into a single, catastrophic beam. The Incarn coalesced where the audience's shock was purest, a silhouette of mourning given swords and mercy, death personified yet somehow transcendent. Shadow fields cracked like breaking glass, ward runes mispronounced themselves in languages that had not been spoken since before the fall, and the Webway's carefully maintained barriers ulcerated into raw warp stuff. The disjunction that followed was Commorragh's greatest crisis since its founding, a catastrophic unravelling that began in the arena districts and spread like infection through the city's arterial networks. Demons poured through the cracks in reality, not the distant whispers of the soul thirst, but the immediate visceral presence of she who thirsts herself, her attention focused with laser intensity on the city that had spent eternity fleeing her embrace. Keepers of secrets materialized in palace courtyards, their perfect forms a mockery of Eldari grace, while demonettes swarmed through market voids where souls had been traded like commodities, their laughter echoing in frequencies that turned sanity into screaming. Entire districts collapsed into the warp as their dimensional anchors failed, thousands of years of careful construction undone in moments of cosmic violence. The Palace of Shades twisted through 17 dimensions simultaneously as its quantum foundations destabilized, while the Needle of Sorrows began to phase in and out of existence like a beacon calling to things that should not be summoned. In the Nexus, markets that had traded in suffering for millennia became battlegrounds, where Kabbalite warriors fought demonic incursions, while their homunculus allies struggled desperately to maintain the reality matrices that kept the city from dissolving entirely. The witch arenas transformed into abattoirs where performers found themselves facing opponents that could not be killed by conventional methods, their perfect choreography useless against entities that existed as pure hunger given form. In the deepest reaches, Elindrak itself convulsed as the mandrakes discovered their shadow realm invaded by darkness that was alien even to their alien nature, while the laboratories of the Haemonculi echoed with the screams of experiments that had suddenly become experimenters, their careful taxonomies of pain reduced to chaos. Yet from this catastrophe, Asdrubal Vecht emerged not weakened but stronger than ever, his genius for turning crisis into opportunity, revealing itself in ways that astounded even his most devoted followers. Where others saw only destruction, he perceived the ultimate consolidation of power, chaos that could eliminate rivals who had survived millennia of careful manipulation, confusion that could cover the final moves in games that had been played since his ascension began. The Supreme Overlord's response revealed the true extent of his foresight and preparation. Emergency protocols activated with clockwork precision, backup reality anchors engaged to stabilize critical districts, and evacuation routes opened onto secure subrealms that had been prepared for exactly this contingency. His warriors moved through the chaos with purpose that spoke of extensive drilling, their objectives clear even as the city transformed around them. Where others improvised desperately, Vecht executed plans that had been refined across centuries of patient preparation. Ancient houses that had maintained independence through careful alliance found themselves isolated in collapsing districts, their portal keys suddenly worthless as the routes they commanded dissolved into void storms. Rival Archons who had spent centuries building power bases discovered that their strongholds existed only in dimensions that no longer connected to the greater city. The cabal of the Blackheart's infrastructure, built with redundancies that had seemed like paranoid excess, proved to be the only reliable network capable of maintaining coherence during the crisis. As the first breaches opened in the arena, kill keys whispered awake across High Commorragh. Portal throats slammed shut with the wet sound of predator jaws. Transit arteries rerouted themselves, sending rival cabals' relief fleets into dead spaces that suddenly weren't there. Emergency gates opened only for ships whose transponders sang the Blackheart's private hymn. In the name of stability, districts at inconvenient angles to his plans were excised like tumours and allowed to fall screaming into the warp, their inhabitants' final moments adding to the psychic resonance that fed his growing power. The old aristocracy, resurrected, across centuries and convinced of their permanence, discovered the price of continuity in a universe where Vecht held the keys to resurrection itself. Haemonculi vats they believed loyal stubbornly refused to decant their patrons. Cloned flesh spoiled on the cusp of readiness, memories curdled like sour wine, and soul traps found themselves already occupied by essence bearing signatures too polite to argue with. The hosts who had once toasted reconciliation on the night of bleeding razors now tried to barter corridors through carnage with favours whose ink had dried into irrelevance. When the last rifts were bound with chains of living runes, and the last districts stopped screaming for help that could not come, Commorragh counted its wounds and found arithmetic inadequate to the task. The disjunction's scars ran deeper than architecture. They had carved new channels through the collective psyche of the Drukhari, creating fractures that no amount of homunculus expertise could heal. The physical devastation was staggering, but it paled in comparison to the philosophical fracture the Inari represented. For the first time since the fall, an alternative existed that did not demand becoming the monster. The Drukhari had defined themselves as the honest damned, the only Eldari who refused the hypocrisy of their craft-world cousins or the desperate gambles of the Corsairs. They had chosen predation over pretense, cruelty over self-deception, and had built their entire civilization upon the principle that survival at any cost was not merely acceptable, but the highest form of wisdom. The Inari offered something more terrifying than damnation. They offered hope. Their path promised deliverance from Slaanesh's curse, a future where the Eldari might be whole again through the awakening of a god who represented endings made meaningful rather than merely final. For the Drukhari, who had built their entire identity around their damnation, such hope was poison more lethal than any homunculus toxin. To embrace the Inari's path would be to admit that their 10,000 years of calculated depravity had been unnecessary, that their entire civilization was a monument to a false premise. It would mean abandoning the very core of their being, the self-imposed damnation that had become their twisted form of freedom. Every act of cruelty would be revealed as choice rather than necessity. Every harvested scream transformed from survival mechanism into conscious evil. Some among the Drukhari felt the pull of Ivrain's promise, Kabbalets who had outlived their loves by 10 lifetimes, Hecatrices whose faith in their own perfection had begun to taste of ash, even a handful of Raks who wondered, in the quiet between appointments, whether identity might be more than a ledger of scars. They slipped away during the chaos, drawn by a gravity older than the city itself, seeking something they had forgotten how to name. But the majority recoiled from this possibility, with visceral horror far greater than any demon could inspire. They saw the Inari not as saviours but as a fundamental threat to their identity, a dangerous delusion that promised salvation but offered only weakness. The Dark City had taught them that mercy was suicide, that compassion was fatal vulnerability, and that hope was the cruelest torture of all. Vecht emerged from the crisis with authority consolidated beyond any previous achievement, his control over the city's infrastructure making resistance not merely dangerous but impossible. The surviving houses found themselves bound to him by chains of dependency that made their former independence seem like childish fantasy. Yet even in triumph, questions lingered that no amount of political mastery could answer. The fracture in the Dark City had been repaired with typical Drukhari efficiency, reality anchors restored, dimensional barriers reinforced, and the familiar rhythms of predation resumed. But the cracks in their certainty would prove far more difficult to heal. The Inari had demonstrated that change was possible, that the Eldari need not remain forever trapped by the choices of their ancestors, that even the soul thirst might not be the inescapable curse they had believed. In the deepest chambers of his reconstructed palace, Vecht contemplated the implications with the cold calculation that had marked his entire reign. The disjunction had eliminated his rivals and strengthened his position, but it had also revealed the fundamental fragility of the civilization he had spent millennia perfecting. They had survived their greatest crisis, but survival was no longer the only question that mattered. The question that haunted Commorragh now was whether redemption was possible for those who had made an art of refusing it, whether beings who had elevated cruelty to philosophy could find their way back to something resembling grace. They had chosen to be the darkness, had embraced their damnation as the price of survival, but the Ynnari had shown them that even the damned could choose the nature of their damnation. As the artificial suns resumed their sterile illumination and the markets reopened their trade in souls and suffering, the Dark City prepared to face a galaxy that had just learned the true depth of its depravity. The disjunction had passed, the immediate crisis had been weathered, but the deeper questions it raised echoed through the shadows like promises of reckonings yet to come. They had proven they could survive the fracture in their dark sanctuary, but the fracture in their souls would challenge them in ways that no amount of cunning or cruelty could address. In choosing to remain what they were, they had also chosen to face whatever consequences that choice would bring, and in the grim darkness of the far future, those consequences were gathering like storm clouds on a horizon that had forgotten how to promise dawn. From the smouldering ruins of the disjunction emerged not a weakened Commorragh, but a predator state refined by crisis into something far more terrible than its creators had ever envisioned. Vekt's consolidation of absolute power had eliminated the last vestiges of internal resistance, transforming the Dark City from a collection of competing fiefdoms into a unified engine of galactic predation, whose efficiency bordered on the supernatural. The fracture that had threatened to destroy their civilization instead became the foundation for its most ambitious expansion, as the Supreme Overlord turned his attention from internal politics to external conquest, with results that would reshape the balance of terror across the galaxy. The universe that spread before their raiding fleets was a feast of desperation unlike anything their ancestors had witnessed during the Empire's Golden Age. The Great Rift had torn reality from the Cadian Gate to the galactic rim, creating wounds in space-time that made navigation treacherous for most species, but provided the Drukhari with unprecedented opportunities for predation. Entire sectors burned with wars that generated vast populations of refugees whose terror had been cultivated by months of constant flight, their suffering already refined to the precise mixture of despair and defiance that yielded the richest psychic resonance. Under Vekt's strategic orchestration, Drukhari raids evolved beyond opportunistic slave-taking into systematic campaigns that demonstrated their growing mastery of their prey's weaknesses. Where once they had terrorized individual worlds, they now orchestrated multi-theater operations that destabilized entire subsectors through surgical strikes against critical infrastructure. A governor assassinated during peace negotiations, a supply convoy destroyed at the moment of greatest need, a Vox relay silenced precisely when reinforcements were requested. These seemingly random acts of violence combined to create cascading failures that generated suffering on scales their ancestors could never have imagined. The cabal of the Black Heart pioneered these concatenated campaigns, their intelligence networks mapping vulnerabilities across multiple star systems with clinical precision. They learned to think in seasons rather than raids, seeding frontier worlds with panic through ritualized disappearances and artifacts that whispered madness into the dreams of the dutiful. Months later, when terror had reached optimal saturation, the harvest fleets would descend with immaculate timing upon populations that had rehearsed their fear until it achieved perfect pitch. Even the galaxy's most dangerous predators found themselves prey to Drukhari sophistication. Chaos warbands discovered that the Dark City's raiders possessed intimate knowledge of warp currents that allowed them to strike at demon worlds themselves, harvesting the servants of the dark gods with methods that impressed entities existing as pure hunger. Tyranid splinter fleets, those cosmic devourers whose appetite rivaled their own, learned that their bioships could be infiltrated by raiders who understood how to turn the great devourer's psychic coordination against itself, paralyzing swarms with their own neural networks. Commorragh itself underwent metamorphosis to accommodate this expansion, absorbing new subrealms and pocket dimensions with voracious appetite. The gloamwood sprouted like a bruise across dimensional seams, its twilight labyrinths catering to nobles whose appetites lay in the slow erasure of hope, rather than its flamboyant destruction. The Bone Bazaar eclipsed older markets, specializing in relics from extinct cultures whose ivory could be made to sing its extinction song. Beneath these heights, the Slipshank provided lawless arteries where vice and rumour flowed like blood through capillaries, policed by Hellion gangs under careful Hecatrix supervision. The Wych Cults elevated spectacle to doctrine, transforming real space raids into moving carnivals of atrocity, where arena pre-shows unfolded across hab-block rooftops and mining pits, lit by the aurora of burning atmospheres. Succubi directed choreographies by Vox from hovering Deuscraft, assigning signature kills to favoured performers while allocating high-value prey to specialists whose instruments could draw novelty from the common clay of mortal fear. The Crucibel's amphitheatres drank terror live through chorus pylons spliced into reality like intravenous lines, their audiences cheering to curated feeds of cities falling in perfect synchronization with the performer's deadly ballet. The homunculus covens burrowed deeper into forbidden inheritance, their experiments growing more ambitious as they incorporated understanding gleaned from the galaxy's mounting chaos. Urian Rakarth emerged from self-imposed silence with revisions to resurrection protocols that reduced variance in memory return to scarcely measurable margins, while Kronos hives synchronized in harmonic arrays could drain terror from battlefields as if sipping from ceremonial bowls. Dark rumours spread of Covenant projects that could cultivate fear lingering in places long after their populations were spent, harvesting terroir from haunted soil like vintage despair. Yet ascendants drew hunters as surely as prey, and the galaxy began to adapt to their methods with disturbing efficiency. The Imperium's Vigilus campaign etched Drukhari sigils into too many after-action reports, prompting Deathwatch kill teams to memorize the rhythm of raider strikes and develop countermeasures that reduced the effectiveness of traditional attack patterns. Rogue traders with personal vendettas learned to trap portals with excommunicate-grade relics, closing dimensional doors on entire flotillas. Even Craftworld outriders shadowed Cabal campaigns, striking not at raiders but at the chorus pylons and pain engine relays that fed Commorragh's theatres, starving the arenas with surgical piety. The Drukhari answered, pressure with refinement, their tactical doctrine evolving to counter each new defensive measure. The Obsidian Rose extended Splinter Technology's reach with munitions that carried despair across kilometres without diminished purity, while the Poison Tongue seeded insurgencies in Imperial underhives months in advance, to guarantee panicked dispersals at the hour of harvest. Microraids replaced grand gestures in certain theatres, each incision designed to remove keystone individuals whose absence would unthread a region's will to resist. Every advance bred counter-advance in an escalating spiral of predation and adaptation. Planetary governors paid pirates to spread false banners, simulating Drukhari raids to secure greater tithes and better defences, diluting terror with disbelief. In certain regions, the empty night answered raiders with silence that felt planned, curated, waiting behind its stillness like a hunter who had learned the Drukhari's own patience. Some worlds bled dry could not bleed again, their populations either extinct or evacuated, leaving behind only echoes where once there had been screams. Inside Commorragh, success multiplied hungers in ways that challenged the city's delicate equilibrium. Young Drukhari, birthed in the aftermath of the disjunction, grew on stories of omnipotence, seeking promotion through feats that frayed the careful balance Vect had spent millennia perfecting. Arena ratings became political currency, ovations traded for raiding windows, while Succubi lobbied Archons with performance metrics, as if war were simply programming with sharper edges. The Covens, secure in their indispensability, began charging in more than flesh and coin, demanding questions, the right to pose them, and time to pursue answers that led into territories best left unexplored. The fundamental paradox of their success became increasingly apparent to those with eyes to see it. The Drukhari had achieved everything they had sought: absolute mastery over their prey, perfect organization of their society, technological advancement that bordered on the miraculous, yet these very achievements had created problems that threatened to make their success meaningless. They were discovering the terrible arithmetic of predation, that efficiency in harvesting created its own hunger, that growth demanded geometric increases in prey, and that their very effectiveness was making the galaxy more dangerous for creatures who depended upon secrecy and surprise. What haunted the highest spires of Commorragh was not the possibility of defeat but the mathematics of victory. The galaxy, vast as it was, contained finite populations, finite capacity for suffering, finite resources that could be harvested before the ecosystems they depended upon collapsed entirely. Their raids had become so frequent, so widespread, that entire sectors were developing immunity to terror through simple exposure, their populations becoming inured to horrors that would have driven their ancestors to madness. The shadow of the Inari lingered like poison in the collective consciousness, their promise of redemption a crack in the facade of absolute certainty that no amount of political mastery could seal. While most Drukhari vehemently rejected this hope, its very existence challenged the fundamental premise that their chosen path of predation was the only way to survive. Some who vanished from cabals during the chaos later reappeared in visions reported by dying humans, described in tones that mixed fear with gratitude, a combination the Drukhari considered chemically incompatible. In the deepest chambers of his reconstructed palace, Vect contemplated implications that stretched beyond immediate tactical concerns to touch the very foundations of their civilization's survival. The Supreme Overlord understood that their current trajectory, however successful in the short term, was ultimately unsustainable. They had become apex predators in a finite ecosystem, and apex predators, by definition, had nowhere left to evolve except into something else entirely. The question that would define their civilization's next phase was not whether they could continue to survive, but whether they could transcend the limitations of their own perfection. They stood at the threshold of possibilities their ancestors could never have imagined, predators so successful that they had begun to prey upon the very concept of predation itself. In the grim darkness of the far future, the Drukhari had ensured their place as both the galaxy's greatest nightmare and perhaps its most honest expression of what sentient life could become when freed from the constraints of hope. As the artificial suns of Commorragh cast their sterile light across districts that sprawled through impossible geometries, as markets traded in commodities that would drive lesser civilizations to madness, as arenas thundered with crowds whose bloodlust sustained the city's hungry foundations, the Dark City faced a future that challenged every assumption upon which it had been built. They had mastered the art of survival through predation, but mastery itself had become a trap as confining as any cage. The long night they had embraced carried within it the seeds of its own conclusion, and the ultimate irony of their existence was that their very success in the hunt brought them ever closer to the moment when even the most efficient predator might find itself starving in a darkness of its own making. The ascendancy that had elevated the Drukhari to unprecedented heights of predatory mastery revealed a disturbing truth about the nature of their success, that beneath the visible hierarchies of cabals, cults, and covens lay depths of strangeness that defied even their own understanding. Vect's consolidation of absolute power had illuminated not just the extent of his control, but the vast territories that lay beyond any single ruler's comprehension. Commorragh was not merely a city, but a living entity whose shadow flesh was riddled with parasitic symbiotes and hidden organs, each serving purposes in a grand design that even its architects could not fully map. In the twilight realm of Elindrak, which overlapped the Dark City's physical structure while remaining fundamentally separate, the mandrakes flickered between dimensions like living nightmares given form. These creatures of crystallized shadow defied every attempt at classification, their anatomy shifting between substance and void according to principles that violated the fundamental laws of physics. They were living night given knife and appetite, their forms composed of darkness so pure it possessed weight and texture, their faces masks that reflected not light but fear itself. The mandrakes served no master but their own incomprehensible hungers, yet they had become integral to Commorragh's ecosystem of terror. They could slip through dimensional barriers as easily as stepping through doorways, appearing in locked chambers to deliver messages written in the language of extinction, or eliminate targets with methods that left no evidence save the lingering scent of ozone and dread. Their very presence fed upon the fear they generated, creating feedback loops of terror that sustained both predator and prey in cycles of mutual dependency that challenged conventional understanding of survival. Among their number moved whispers of Caradruach, the Decapitator, a figure so steeped in legend that even speaking his name was said to invite his attention. He hunted leaders across realities, collecting skulls that still remembered command, assembling what some believed was a key for a door that no sane mind wished opened. His trophies did not decay, but listened, their empty sockets tracking movements in dimensions that existed only as concept, their silence pregnant with the weight of interrupted authority. Above these shadow realms, in the crystal spires where power wore masks of civility, Lady Malice of the Cabal of the Poisoned Tongue walked between futures with the confidence of one who had already witnessed every possible outcome. Her crystalline heart, a relic of technologies that predated the fall, deflected even Slaanesh's whispers while granting her insights into the true nature of causality itself. She moved through court politics like a master strategist playing regicide with maps of tomorrow, her prophecies unfolding across decades with precision that seemed almost supernatural. Malice spoke of futures as if they were rooms she had already redecorated, and reality obliged by conforming to her expectations. Her laughter sometimes arrived before her body. Her warnings were delivered through sealed letters that opened themselves at precisely the moment their contents became relevant, and her enemies discovered that crossing her was to invite a future where every choice led to ruin. She embodied the manipulation of fate itself, trading in inevitabilities, with the casual efficiency of a merchant dealing in more mundane commodities. If Malice represented the mastery of destiny, Drazha embodied its execution with perfection, so complete it transcended mere skill to become theology. The Master of Blades remained an enigma wrapped in legends, his true identity hidden beneath layers of mystery that even the most skilled interrogators could not penetrate. Some whispered he was Ara the fallen Phoenix reborn, the first of the Phoenix Lords who had embraced darkness and transformed into something beyond redemption. Others claimed he was something else entirely, a living weapon forged by forces that predated their civilization's fall. To watch him duel was to witness violence elevated to its purest form, each movement a prayer offered to the geometry of death, each strike a verse in the liturgy of perfect lethality. He fought without apparent effort, his tormentor helm reflecting the faces of opponents even as his clave opened them to new understandings of mortality. Incubi shrines altered their curricula to echo his footwork, while Archons began hiring philosophers disguised as bodyguards, understanding that his presence transformed any engagement from mere combat into artistic expression. The courts of the Archons gathered beings so specialized in their particular forms of horror that they had transcended the boundaries between servant and weapon. Lamaean poisoners moved through halls of power with grace that concealed their deadly nature, their knowledge of toxins so encyclopedic they could kill with a caress or preserve life indefinitely according to their whim. Eslith bodyguards coiled through shadows with serpentine intelligence, their loyalty purchasable but never truly owned, their protection worth any price yet never guaranteed beyond the terms of their contracts. Medusi drifted like captured thoughts given form, their psychic emanations reading intentions before they crystallized into action, their gaze capable of turning thoughts to crystal and memories to sculpture. Ughouls prowled the deepest chambers with senses that tracked fear itself, their claws rending both flesh and spirit with equal efficiency. Each relationship in these courts was a thread in a web that stretched across dimensions and species, creating dependencies that existed partially in real space and partially in the warp. Beyond even these visible mysteries lay the forgotten nodes and abandoned way stations that stretched through the Webway's deepest arteries. Some were pocket dimensions captured and integrated into Commorragh's sprawling form, realms of perpetual twilight used for cultivating specific varieties of fear, spaces where time flowed backward to enable tortures that rewound endlessly, voids where sound did not travel that served as venues for conspiracies too dangerous to speak aloud. These hidden territories provided havens for entities that had chosen to make their homes in the interstitial spaces of the Dark City, creating ecosystems within ecosystems, predation pyramids that fed upon the waste products of larger hierarchies. From these places, new threats could emerge, new philosophies could take root, and new forms of cruelty could be perfected before being absorbed into the greater organism of Commorragh when their utility became apparent. The deeper one penetrated into these shadow realms, the more apparent it became that the Drukhari had created something that transcended their conscious design. They had built not merely a civilization but a living entity that possessed its own terrible intelligence, a predator so sophisticated it had begun to prey upon the very concept of predation itself. Every shadow concealed another shadow, every secret hid a deeper mystery, every act of cruelty rippled through unseen channels to affect outcomes that stretched across the galaxy. This ecosystem of horror had evolved according to its own alien logic, creating relationships and dependencies that challenged the sanity of those who glimpsed their true scope. The trinity of cables, cults, and covens represented only the visible surface of a web whose true complexity lay hidden in dimensions that existed more as concept than place. Information flowed through networks that spanned realities, carried by entities that could slip between states of existence as easily as breathing. Their messages encoded in languages that predated the fall and sealed with contracts written in substances that existed only in the spaces between atoms. Yet even these perfect expressions of predatory evolution could not escape the fundamental paradox that haunted their civilization. The ecosystem they had created was magnificent in its efficiency, terrible in its beauty, and utterly unsustainable in its ultimate trajectory. They had achieved mastery over every form of horror except the one that mattered most: the slow realization that their perfect system of survival was consuming the very foundations upon which it rested. In the grim darkness of the far future, the Drukhari had proven that intelligence without restraint could achieve anything except escape from the consequences of its own success. Their hidden depths contained mysteries that challenged the boundaries of sanity, secrets that revealed the true scope of what they had become in their flight from damnation. They were the architects of a nightmare so sophisticated that even they could not comprehend its full implications, masters of a web so intricate that even its weavers had become trapped within its strands. As the artificial suns cast their sterile light across districts that sprawled through impossible geometries, as beings of living shadow flickered between dimensions and prophets walked among futures that could never be changed, the Dark City prepared to confront the ultimate question that all their mastery had been designed to avoid. They had built a perfect machine for harvesting suffering, but perfection itself had become the trap that would force them to face the one enemy they had never learned to defeat: the implications of their own terrible success. The labyrinthine complexity revealed in Commorragh's hidden depths, the shadow realms where mandrakes flicker between dimensions, the courts where prophets walk among futures, the ecosystems of predation so intricate that even their architects cannot map their full scope, illuminates a truth more profound than any individual horror the Dark City has spawned. The Drukhari are not merely survivors who chose cruelty as their salvation. They are the galaxy's most honest mirror, reflecting back the capacity for evil that lurks within all sentient life, and in their crystallized malice lies a question that challenges every assumption about morality, necessity, and the ultimate meaning of existence itself. In their brutal honesty lies perhaps their most disturbing quality. Where the Imperium cloaks its atrocities in the righteous garments of the Emperor's will, burning worlds in the name of salvation while counting the ashes as holy, the Drukhari embrace their nature without pretense or apology. When an Imperial Inquisitor orders the extermination of 1 billion souls to prevent heretical contamination, he tells himself he serves a higher purpose. When a Chaos cultist sacrifices innocence to feed his patron's hunger, he believes he hastens his own transcendence. When a Drukhari harvests suffering to feed the soul thirst, he knows exactly what he is doing and why. Survival, pure and simple, stripped of every ornamental lie. This philosophical clarity grants them a terrible coherence that their enemies lack. They do not claim their actions serve cosmic balance or divine will. They do not pretend their cruelty elevates its victims, or that their predation fulfills some greater destiny. They are honest predators in a universe that thrives on dishonest ones, and this stark authenticity may make them less morally corrupt than those who dress genocide in scripture or torture in righteousness. In their refusal to justify what cannot be justified, they achieve a kind of purity that is both admirable and horrifying. Yet this philosophical acceptance has created a trap more confining than any physical constraint. Consider the Archon who has died 9 times and risen 10, each resurrection perfect except for the microscopic seam no one else can perceive, a private tremor in the rhythm of his thoughts. His rivals vanish during crises, his cabal prospers, the markets whisper his name with fear that tastes like loyalty. Yet, in the silence between audiences, when Lamaeans have withdrawn and Sith stand distant as statues, he wonders what memory the Coven's harvested from his mind and kept for their collections. He tells himself it does not matter, that nothing matters except the next season's yield, but the question gnaws like a second soul thirst. Consider the succubus whose blade work has transcended mere skill to become something approaching divine art. The crucible thunders with ovations. Her performances are liturgies written in blood. Her enemies die in poses so elegant that audiences gasp before remembering to scream. When she returns to her trophy vaults where narc roses wilt in precise sympathy with her moods, the emptiness remains. She has attained the apex every witch craves, yet the metronome at her core continues its familiar hunger. She can drain amphitheatres of their bloodlust and still feel hollow. When whispered emissaries speak of gods who turn death into meaning rather than mere consumption, she laughs with the practiced dismissal of one who fears what she cannot afford to believe. Consider the homunculus who has mapped the harmonics of despair until he can orchestrate a civilization's collapse in a single perfect symphony. He has catalogued suffering by terroir and species, refined resurrection until memory returns tighter than fresh skin, created pain engines that harvest agony with the precision of master vintners. One day, in corridors lit by organs trained to glow under duress, he pauses before vats where clone flesh ripens, and for one scandalous heartbeat does not remember why any of this matters. Then the moment passes, instruments remember his hands, and the work continues because the work is all that remains. Their very success has revealed the fundamental flaw in their perfect system. The Drukhari have become apex predators so specialized in their ecological niche that they cannot survive in any other role, cannot adapt to changing circumstances except through refinement of existing methods, cannot conceive of responses to new challenges beyond applying familiar solutions with greater intensity. They are evolution's dead end disguised as its pinnacle, the ultimate expression of a philosophy that prioritizes immediate survival over long-term viability. The galaxy, vast as it appears, contains finite populations capable of generating the terror they require for sustenance. Their raids have become so frequent, so widespread, that entire sectors develop immunity to horror through simple exposure. Populations either flee beyond their reach, or become so inured to atrocity that they yield diminishing returns of psychic resonance. The ecosystem they depend upon grows more dangerous as their prey adapts, learns to fight back with desperate ferocity, develops countermeasures that make traditional approaches increasingly costly and less effective. They are consuming the very foundation that sustains them, creating a future where even perfect predators will find themselves starving in darkness of their own making. The emergence of the Inari struck at the heart of their identity with surgical precision, offering something more terrifying than any demon incursion or military defeat: the possibility of change. Ivrain's transformation from arena performer to divine emissary demonstrated that even the most committed Drukhari could transcend the limitations they had accepted as fundamental laws of existence. To the Drukhari, hope is the cruelest weapon ever deployed against them, for hope demands an answer to questions they have built an empire to avoid. If redemption is possible, then their 10,000 years of systematic atrocity become choice rather than necessity. If the soul thirst can be cured, then every harvested scream represents conscious evil rather than survival mechanism. Most recoil from this possibility with visceral horror because accepting it would require acknowledging that their perfected system of predation serves no purpose beyond perpetuating itself. They have chosen to be the galaxy's nightmare, but nightmares, by their very nature, cannot dream of becoming anything else. They exist to embody fear, to serve as cautionary tales, to represent what happens when civilization fails, but in accepting this role so completely, they have surrendered their capacity to envision alternatives. In the deepest chambers of their crystalline spires, where artificial suns cast light that illuminates without warming and shadows move with purposes of their own, the ultimate paradox of their existence becomes clear. They have achieved everything they set out to accomplish: survival, mastery, the transformation of necessity into art form, yet these very achievements have created a prison more confining than death itself. They are trapped in an eternal present, unable to grow beyond what they have become, unable to hope for anything beyond the next harvest, the next temporary reprieve from the hunger that defines them. Their immortality, purchased through resurrection techniques and sustained by stolen suffering, has become a curse disguised as blessing. Where death might offer the transformation or release, they have chosen continuity without evolution. The soul thirst represents more than hunger. It is the physical manifestation of their spiritual paralysis, the clock that disciplines with absence and enforces with dread. They have engineered a perfect closed loop that eliminates genuine choice while maintaining the illusion of agency, believing they choose to be predators while trapped in a system where predation is the only option their philosophy allows them to perceive. In the end, the Drukhari represent both the ultimate expression of the will to survive and its ultimate futility. They have proven that intelligence without wisdom can achieve anything except happiness, that power without purpose leads only to emptiness, that survival without growth is merely elaborate suicide. They are the honest monsters in a universe full of hypocritical ones, the perfect predators in an ecosystem they are slowly destroying through their own efficiency. They stand as both warning and mirror, reflecting back to every observer the fundamental question that defines sentient existence. When survival demands becoming the monster, what remains of the soul? Worth saving? In their endless fall lies the answer they have spent 10 millennia refusing to acknowledge, that sometimes the greatest tragedy is not failure but success, achieved at the cost of everything that made success meaningful. They are the echo of Slaanesh's birth scream made manifest in crystallized malice. Forever falling through darkness they have embraced, forever refusing to acknowledge that even the damned can choose the nature of their damnation. In their crystalline spires and shadow markets, in their arenas of choreographed death and laboratories of living horror, they have built a monument to a simple, terrible truth. That existence without the possibility of redemption is not life, but merely elaborate dying, stretched across eternity like a scream that never ends. They are the children of a dying star, beautiful and terrible in their descent toward inevitable extinction, their brilliance sustained by consuming everything around them until nothing remains but the cold perfection of their own refined darkness. They have chosen to fall rather than fly, to embrace shadow rather than seek light, to perfect their damnation rather than struggle toward grace, cruel, shadowed, ruthless, and utterly, irrevocably alone in their perfect understanding of what they have chosen to become. Nightmares cannot dream.